This government can't handle racism. Boris Johnson is launching an inquiry into institutional racism in the UK in response to the Black Lives Matter protests. Now, obviously, I'd love him to succeed, but I just don't think he's willing or able. So what's the problem we're dealing with? For starters, are we an equal opportunity country? Researchers at Oxford University tested how just the Englishness of your name can affect your opportunities in life. They sent out 3,200 job applications using identical CVs and cover letters and found that people with Nigerian, Pakistani or Middle Eastern names had to send between 70 and 90% more applications just to get one job offer. Now, given that employers decide people's quality of life, there's no getting away from the fact that life in this country passes through a filter of racism. And Boris Johnson, with his majority of 80 MPs, could punch a massive hole in that filter by forcing employers to use blind CVs so they only see the national insurance number of each candidate and not their name, sex or gender. Still waiting on that one. And even when announcing his new racism review, Boris Johnson said,
"What I really want to do as Prime Minister is change the narrative so we stop the sense of victimization."
As if supposedly all the problems that I just mentioned are just because black people like to feel like victims. We also know that UK police stop and search black people 10 times more than white people. Now, the moment I say that, a certain type of person will say, but look at the crime stats, as if being black makes you naturally more into crime. Tell me, how many middle-class black people do you see carrying knives? The links between poverty, lack of opportunity and crime are well known. Speaking about research conducted in London, Lawrence Guinness of the Childhood Trust said that the areas with the highest number of recorded violent crimes are neighbouring those with the highest levels of people in poverty. Now, I've never lived in an area where I felt that if I wasn't myself carrying a knife, I might not make it home. I'm also financially comfortable. But what if I was born without those privileges? What if you were? We've already established that it's 80% harder for somebody with a name like mine to get a job, so compared to my white neighbours who are also in poverty, I would be 80% more trapped in that poverty. And we know that poverty levels among black people are significantly higher. So the cherry on top, those whose racism traps me in the economic group most likely to commit crime will then use those crime stats to justify their racism against me. So, knowing that stop and search has historically been racially discriminatory, what did Boris Johnson have to say?
Because I believe there's frankly nothing kinder or more loving than that you can do. If you see a young kid coming down the streets who may be carrying a knife, than to ask him to turn out, or her, but almost invariably him, to turn out his pockets and produce that knife.
By telling police officers to stop people based on a visual assessment, he's essentially giving police officers license to racially profile. And what's worse, that's not even the law. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act says you need to have reasonable grounds to suspect that specific individual of committing a crime, which is completely at odds with what our Prime Minister is telling police officers. Which brings us to Hugo Boateng, the 13-year-old boy who was stopped, chased, and nearly tasered by police when he was on a charity bike ride with his father in June. The officers said that they were looking for somebody who matched the description of black males on bikes. Are you kidding me? Does that sound like reasonable grounds for tasering someone to you? When the Prime Minister is giving police officers permission to break the law in such a racially discriminatory way, distrust between black people and police officers will only grow. For example, the fact that an American police officer killed George Floyd by putting his knee on his neck is a lot less surprising when you know that Trump said this.
Please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, you know, the way you put their hand over. Like, don't hit their head, and they've just killed somebody, don't hit their head. I said, you can take the hand away, okay?
And Trump's response to the riots was to quote a well-known racist police officer from the 60s saying, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And Boris Johnson refused 3 times in Parliament to even criticise Trump for quoting a racist police officer when threatening the lives of those rioting against racist police. And a few weeks later, UK police officer David Herold put his knee on the neck of a black suspect until he screamed, "Kills my neck!" Racism and intolerance trickles from the top down. When Boris Johnson likened Muslim women to bank robbers, attacks on Muslim women spiked immediately. When he won a campaign that labelled EU citizens as a burden on the country, we saw the sharpest rise in hate crime in living memory. The best way to tackle racism is via education. In school and history classes, all I learnt about were stories of UK achievements and victories across the world. All other countries were either enemies or places we'd saved. So is it really surprising that we still have a problem with white supremacy and British exceptionalism to the point that people genuinely believe that 27 other countries need us more than we need them? If everyone was taught the simple fact that Western economic superiority came about in part due to the colonization, rape, murder, enslavement, and robbery of countries we now see as inferior, we'd stop seeing them as inferior. So how does Boris Johnson fit into that? He once said that the problem in Africa is not that we were once in charge, but that we're not in charge anymore. What's needed in the UK history curriculum is the legally compulsory inclusion of empire, our role in the slave trade, as well as our actions in Ireland, so that kids know that we were not always the good guy in every single story. But clearly we have a Prime Minister who thinks we were. Now, the tragedy is that since 2016, our country has consistently been voting for parties that are significantly more tolerant and progressive than the Tories. But because there are lots of parties on the left, that vote is split and the Tories keep winning. So if UK politics is ever going to reflect the modern, decent values of the majority of people in our country, we need to move our electoral system towards proportional representation. But the Tories won't do it because they keep winning as it is now. My only hope is that in their next manifesto, Labour will be better than that. So, the reforms in education, policing, employment and democracy that are necessary to remove systemic racism from our country are incompatible with the beliefs, actions and interests of our government. So while I do wish Boris Johnson the best in his efforts to change the narrative, that won't happen until we get a government that's willing to change the reality.